Assalamualaikum and a very good afternoon, Tan Sri, distinguished guests, ladies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, and also our distinguished panelists. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent lockdowns, full and partial, since March 2020, we have lost over 3,000 lives and over 600,000 Malaysians are infected, and many are still struggling to recover from it. Livelihoods from own account workers to full-time employees, business owners, especially micro and medium-sized enterprises, have lost the source of income, and many must close their businesses that have been around probably for decades. To mitigate the adverse effects, several counter-cyclical measures were introduced over the period of 15 months. And this has totaled up to 380 billion ringgit, or about 24% of the GDP. The GDP growth, however, improved to negative 0.5% year-on-year in the first quarter from negative 3.4% in the previous quarter. It was supported by exports, which have been exceeding pre-pandemic levels since June 2020, surged 63% in April this year. The recovery, however, appears to be undermined when a fortnight ago the infection rates began to increase and led to a second nationwide lockdown on 1st June and until the end of the month. This prolonged pandemic raises many questions, and some of those includes what are some of the trade-offs between short-term counter-cyclical measures that I've mentioned earlier versus long structural policies, fiscal versus monetary, lives versus livelihoods, and various other public policy allocation issues. Are there complementarities among the various policy options that the government and private sector can harness to achieve sustainable growth and higher standard of living? The government spending exceeded the revenue collected and increased our national budget to 60% of the GDP. And this is of concern because the question is, how would it impact the economy? However, to put things in perspective or into historical context, when our economy went through the 1986-87 crisis, the debt to GDP ratio then was 103% to 102% respectively in these 2 years. And then we experienced the double whammy of the twin deficits. The discussion this afternoon aims to contribute to the continuing policy deliberations on the optimal policy mix and implementation priorities between these goals. Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us three very distinguished professional economists who have served as academics and sat in several government committees in Malaysia and outside Malaysia. Allow me to introduce the three speakers. Yang Berbahagia Datuk Professor Wu Wing Tai. Professor Wu heads the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia and Jeffrey Sachs Center on Sustainable Development, the Vice President for Asia and UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network in New York City. Professor Wu is also Zhang Jiang Professor at Fudan University in Shanghai, Distinguished Fellow at Penang Institute, 1000 Talent in Shanghai, Distinguished Fellow at Penang Institute, and also a Distinguished Professor Emeritus at University of California, Davis. He has been an advisor to several centrally planned economies on their transition strategies to market economy, and Indonesia on growth strategies in the 1990s. Professor Wu advised China on the comprehensive fiscal reforms implemented in January 1994 and the US Treasury in 1997-98 on Asian financial crisis. Professor Wu was Special Officer for East Asia in the UN Millennium Project. In 2005, he was appointed an advisor to Prime Minister Abdullah Badawi, and in 2008, he was economic advisor to Chief Minister Lim Guan Eng. And currently, Professor Wu is working on sustainable development goals with projects on green finance, middle income trap, and global economic architecture for the multipolar world. Our second speaker, who this afternoon is reporting for duty again to the Economic Planning Unit, is Yang Berbahagia Professor Tan Sri Datuk Sri Dr. Nur Azlan Ghazali. He is a professor of economics at Graduate School of Business in UKM. He is a member of the Economic Action Council and currently the executive director of the Secretariat of the EAC. He is a Mason Fellow of the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and also a Commonwealth Fellow of Financial Economics and Banking of the Association of Commonwealth Universities. He was conferred with the Honorary Professor of Economics by the University of Cyberjaya, Malaysia, for his immense contribution to Malaysia's economic development. He received the Distinguished Civilian Service Award for 2020, and his expertise is widely recognized, being a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank Malaysia from 2015 to 2019 and the National Planning Council since 2014, and he is the 10th Vice Chancellor of UKM from 2014 to 2018. And our third speaker, who may have to go second while waiting for Tan Sri Nur Azlan complete his first meeting this afternoon, is Professor Ye Kim Ling, who's also the Deputy President of the Malaysian Economic Association. He is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Economics Studies Program at the Jeffrey Chia Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University. He assumed the current position in May 2016 following a 2-year stint as a business school dean at another local private university. And prior to that, he has spent 20 years in the private sector in various roles as chief economist of the country's leading domestic credit rating agency, principal consultant in a consultancy services subsidiary, and senior analyst at a national policy research institute. His research interests spanned from development economics, monetary and financial economics, capital markets, and industry studies. He has also served, like Tan Sri Nur Azlan, he has served as the external member of the Central Bank's Monetary Policy Committee and several other government-related technical working groups and committees. And if I can repeat what Karen has mentioned, that we'll get all the 3 speakers to speak. They are given 15 minutes each. And after all the 3 panelists have spoken, we will open for discussion. So may I now invite Professor Wu Wing Tai. Professor Wing.
Well, thank you, Dr. Professor Norma, for the kind introduction. I must express my great pleasure that the Jeffrey Chia Institute is able to host this event with the Malaysian Economic Association on the very important economic events that are happening to us and which might have severe long-run consequences. So let us talk about the probability of us being turned this crisis ahead of us into an opportunity to achieve economic dynamism. I would to get your attention, I will reverse the ranking of the topics on the program. I will first talk about the high growth policy package that we should seek to achieve, and then go on and talk about the complementary pandemic action program that we must put in place for future pandemics. We have two big problems facing us. One is, of course, the pandemic, and the other one is that our growth rate has slowed down substantially in the 21st century. When we talk, so I'll start with the growth policy package. Clearly, all of us will agree that the condition to be a high-income country is that everybody is producing an output that is valued at the level of the GDP per capita of a high-income country. We need a G7 level of labor productivity. And not only that, that level of productivity must grow at least at the same pace of the growth rate of labor productivity in the G7 countries. From an accounting perspective, what produces high labor productivity is clear. One is you need a high capital labor ratio. You not only need a lot of automation, you also need highly educated people. So a high capital labor ratio could be achieved only with high investment in physical infrastructure, in physical private capital, and in education. The next prerequisite would be that we need to have a level of technology that is equivalent or close to that of a G7 country. And the third is we need to have a high level of efficiency in production and in the working of the government. And clearly, our government is very much aware of that a high degree of efficiency is needed, which is why we have the implementation and coordination unit and Pemandu. And clearly, there has to be a lack of policy paralysis in order for the government to act decisively. So high degree of social trust is needed. Having said these three factors from an accounting point of view, we have to recognize that these are factors that the Malaysian government already knows. In fact, I think everyone in the audience have heard about the need to do better on those three factors: the getting investment rate up, improving the level of technology, and increasing the level of efficiency. Recently, Dato Sri Nasir Razak made some very insightful comments on the need for economic reform in Malaysia in order to put in an additional measure of economic dynamism into the economy. His recent comments actually echo what his older brother Najib Razak said in April 2009 when he became Prime Minister. Najib Razak called for a new economic model, and on the basis of different comments heard and reported in the media, we all had certain expectations about what the new economic model would look like. But when it was unveiled 1 year later, that it was significantly different from what many people had expected. Many of the old policies were left in place, like for example, the quota on the discount in the sale of luxury homes to members of the Bhumiputra community. So the new was not so new, but nevertheless, there was progress, and this progress was sufficient to propel the Malaysian economy to grow at 4.5% a year, but 4.5 is still substantially lower than the 7.7% average growth of the 1970 to 1997 era. So for almost 30 years in the last part of the 20th century, we grew at 7.7%, but since the start of the 21st century, our growth rate had come down to 4.5. We, of course, also realize that we need a high level of technology and also to improve efficiency, which is why we see continued high budget allocations in the budget to the education ministries. And we have a continual rollout of educational blueprints one after another to improve the education outcomes, like on the PISA, OECD PISA scores. And we have put in place a hyperactive World Talent recruitment program. But however, judging by the continued low ranking of our universities in global ranking exercises, and if you look at the number of patents obtained by Malaysians, we are still lagging behind in terms of being able to generate knowledge-led growth. So it's not that we have not put in make efforts in all three factors, but it has so far failed to achieve the very good outcome that we were expecting. Well, the progress on these existing economic agendas, in my opinion, will continue to be slow until the public is assured that these reforms do not undermine the targets of the new economic policy, which we all accept, a fair share of wealth to the Bumiputra community, and the elimination of poverty in all its dimensions. We have to be assured that these reforms will not undermine these targets, and we have to be assured that they are replacing the the existing NEP policy instruments with new instruments that will strengthen the incentive for domestic investors so that we can get the capital labor ratio up, that it will increase the retention of Malaysian talent, which means that we are able to climb up the value-added ladder faster, and to improve the efficiency in the largest firms, which in many cases would be the state-owned companies, the state-linked companies, and the state and the government-linked banks. We have made progress on these existing economic agendas, but the pace has been slower than what we were hoping to see. However, additional economic dynamism can still be generated by new actions. Like, for example, we can certainly accelerate the growth of the SME sector and the growth of SMEs into larger enterprises. And I think the one way to do it is through financial sector reform. One unfortunate outcome of the policy response to the Asian financial crisis was that we had eliminated most small and medium banks and consolidated them into large banks. The fact in the world is that small and medium enterprises are able to get credit most readily from small and medium banks. So after the consolidation of the financial sector in the Asian financial crisis, there was a shortage of credit available for SMEs, and our response was to set up an SME bank. And unfortunately, the SME bank has now become the government-linked bank that has the largest amount of non-performing loans. The solution is to complement the SME bank by allowing once again the establishment and growth of small and medium private banks. They are the ones that would lend funds most readily to small and medium enterprises. This is something that we have seen most recently in China. China realizes that small and medium banks is the answer to the flowering of the SME sector. And of course, we got to invest in modern infrastructure like a better high-speed internet network, a point that was specially brought up after COVID-19 hits us, and we realized that we shouldn't make our children climb up trees in order to get better Wi-Fi reception. We have to stop the making monkeys out of our children and instead put in a fiber network that extends internationally. And we got to also think about integrating the country better with things like a high-speed train line that goes not only from Singapore to KL but to Alostar as well. And eventually it will be part of a continental high-speed train system. One barrier to a high-speed train line is the thinking that the high-speed train line must pay for itself, just like the mistaken thinking that the MRT should pay for itself entirely on collection of fees from the riders. That's the wrong thinking. It is because a modern transportation system creates a lot of benefits like higher land values and higher stock market value of existing firms. So what it means is we got to have a tax system to be able to collect such kinds of newly created wealth in order to support the modern high-speed train system. Similarly, I think we should strengthen educational and R&D performance by fully mobilizing the private education institutions to allow them to partner more with international highly ranked universities. We see that in the Asian countries that have caught up, Japan and South Korea, we can see that while the best and highest ranking universities in Japan are Tokyo University and Kyoto University, but right next to them, very close to them, would be Keio University and Waseda University, both private universities. Competition is good. It causes the public institutions to function better. Similarly, if you look at Korea, besides Seoul National University, right next to it would be Yonsei University and Korea University, both private universities which were able to raise the level of research and teaching in the public university. So I think there are lots of things that we have heard about and are doing. I'd like to talk about barriers to economic growth that are less discussed in this country. And I would like to talk about the outside challenges that will come that could impede economic dynamism in Malaysia. Basically, we cannot just look at our belly button and think of all the internal challenges that we have to overcome. We have also to realize the external challenges that we have to overcome. There are two trends in the world that we need to pay notice to in order to maintain economic dynamism in Malaysia. The first trend that we see is the race to achieve carbon neutrality in the European Union, North America, and in China, Korea, and Japan. The attitude in most developing countries, of which we are not an exception, is that we look at the investment cost that are necessary in order to achieve carbon neutrality. So our attitude is, if we can think of a way in which this investment cost, or we can wait until the technologies are more developed and hence lower cost, and hence we switch to them. What we need to know is that in the European Green Deal, it is explicitly stated that Europe will soon start imposing border adjustment taxes on goods from countries with weak climate action policies. When we saw that in Europe, of course we are concerned. Then we think about, well, we could still sell to China and North America. After all, Donald Trump was thumping his nose and making fun of the race to zero that was happening in the European Union. But in the recent Shanghai meeting between the Chinese environmental minister and John Kerry, the special US ambassador on climate, they have agreed to work together to fight global climate change. What that means is the United States and China will not become negative carbon emitters in order to allow ASEAN to be positive carbon emitters. Basically, if we do not achieve carbon neutrality in a reasonable period of time, we will face a great loss in our international competitiveness. Here, the government has to take an important coordination role. Let me take the case of Sunway Corporation, which has set its eye on achieving carbon neutrality. We found that the biggest source of the carbon emission in the value chain of Sunway Corporation is in the energy we buy from Tenaga. So within Sunway, we have got lots of proposals about how to achieve green energy supply. So we have lots of suggestions on how we should put up our own solar farms. But however, the cost of each individual Malaysian company in producing green energy will be much higher. The cost of the individual actions will be much higher than the cost of turning Tenaga's energy supply to green energy. So this is where government leadership is needed. The government has to take the lead to support the private sector awareness of the changes in the international environment, and we have to also embrace the enlightened self-interest that climate change is bad for Malaysia. The other thing that we have to be aware of that would be of importance to maintaining the international competitiveness of Malaysia is the escalating US-China geostrategic competition, which has already resulted in the end of the beginning of the end of the WTO system. The US-China trade war is a violation of the WTO system, and this could easily spill over, whereby we will be forced to choose sides. This is something that is definitely not something we want to do. We want to be neutral and to help diffuse the geostrategic competition between the two countries. This means that Malaysia has to support the United Nations agencies and WTO in order to prevent this geostrategic competition from getting out of hand. And ASEAN cohesion has to be important so that we can retain the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, which our goods have to be shipped through. So we have to not only be participating in the global effort of achieving carbon neutrality, and we at Sunway University is leading a Green ASEAN Future project in which 7 ASEAN countries are participating in. I would say that we would very much welcome efforts by members of the audience to participate in this green project. So I would like to end my presentation by saying, yes, there's a lot of internal reforms we need to do, but we must also keep our eye open on what's happening outside. And keeping an eye in the future means that we have to put in place a pandemic action program that is guided by enlightened self-interest. In other words, we have to invest more in public health, in the monitoring of health domestically, the provision of health to every Malaysian resident, regardless of whether the resident is a citizen or a foreign worker. And we have to act decisively early so that we can keep the death rates down until better treatment and other kinds of medical advances appear. And we have to differentiate between economic management in normal times versus economic management in emergency times. Concerns about a budget deficit should be held in check, largely because we are talking about disaster relief, short-term disaster relief. We will deal with the budget situation when times return back to normal. We also have to put in place emergency income distribution measures. We have to extend loans to SMEs that will have to be written down as the economy recovers. So we have to extend income distribution like measures like subsidized healthcare to the poor and to the foreign workers. At the same time, we have to enhance international cooperation on the health front. And cooperation on the health front actually means support for a minimum global tax on capital. Right now, capital is running to low-tax countries, depriving countries from being able to tax capital adequately in order to provide an adequate level of health care to our citizens. So I think what we need to think about is we have to put in place a pandemic action program that will be ready to face the next pandemic that comes. So I stopped here, and I invite you to send me your comments if you are too shy to speak up during Q&A. And I would like to invite you to come work with JCI and the Jeffrey Sachs Center on the ASEAN Green Future project, which I had talked about. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wu, who has spoke at length on not only how we should address this pandemic and mitigate the adverse effects, but also on the structural problems or issues that is facing us. He spoke about raising productivity, issues that affects our potential output, and also the external challenges such as the climate change and how ASEAN too can play a role in the geopolitics that we are facing. Yeah? So if you have any questions, comments, don't be shy, because this time around, you don't have to stand up and speak, but you can write in our chat box. May I now invite our second speaker, Tansino Azlan. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Dato' Norma. My colleagues on the panel, and also everyone there virtually. Can you hear me well? Okay. Now, I'm involved in dealing with this COVID-19 crisis and the related economic problems that we are seeing now, I will say from day one. But I would like to, before we go a bit more deeper into what is the current situation, I think it's very important to understand where we were before. You know, we were talking about moving forward to be a high-income nation, or maybe in the right word, to be an advanced nation, because there are countries that are high income, but they are not advanced. So probably let's take both of them, high income and advanced nation. But broadly, let's look at some numbers just to give us some common picture of seeing where is Malaysia. Way back in 1990, we set this 30 years vision. You know, at that time, income per capita that normally being used as a measurement is about $2,586 per capita. Let's not comment about that, because I know there are a lot of issues with that by itself. And at that time, the high income level is around 7,600 plus. And what we have seen, you know, over the years, I mean, we've been singing a lot of songs, we've been doing many things, we passed through various, on my count, there are 6 5-year plans, you know, that total up to about 30 years, from 6 Malaysia plan all the way to 11 Malaysia plan. And they come, when it becomes so near to the end of the Vision 2020, only then, I think at least 5-10 years before, we start to look at it, hey, where are we now? You know, by numbers, not bad actually. Income by just pure numbers, it has multiplied by about 4.3 times. So in 2019, I'm talking about before COVID arrived Malaysia, income per capita is around 11,213. So that's a lot. I mean, multiplied by 4 plus. But at the same time, I mean, the level of high income as defined by the World Bank, if many of you are following that, the latest revision was in 2020 last year, which is at around 12,500. So basically we are short. We are short by, if we use that measure, we are short just by about 10.5%. Again, if you want to say it's a failure, yes, it is. But for me, setting a vision will push everybody moving forward. But the achievement is quite something that we can say, well, quite interesting. I mean, it takes Malaysia so close, about 10.5%. And unfortunately, 2020, the year that we should celebrate, we get this COVID arrived Malaysia. And very quickly, we all know the growth has declined. I mean, minus 5.6%. And our income per capita has basically dropped back now to around maybe 10,000, in the range of 10,000 plus US dollar, 10,270 to be more specific. Well, but these are numbers. I mean, yes, the World Bank in their latest report, I mean, many of you, I'm sure, have read the Aiming High reports of Malaysia's World Bank, says that in 5 years' time, probably by mid of the, I mean, 5 years down the line, 2025, we probably will reach that level of high income. As you know, we are moving, the rest are moving, but by 2025, we'll be there. Now, those are just numbers. I mean, to me, being a high income or advanced nation carries a lot of meanings behind it. And I think this is where the challenge are. While we are facing the crisis, are we attending the crisis and having that goal in our mind? Or are we mere attending the crisis? And if we are successful in attending the crisis, we are reverting back to where we were before. You know, I mean, I spent a bit time of looking at some documents, preparing for this webinar. I look at the 5-year plan, the new, I mean, since the 6th Malaysia plan, all the way to 11th Malaysia plan. I look at the new economic model. Prof. Dato Norma was very involved in the new economic model during Tan Sri Amir Sham's time, and you know, and in the 2010, something like that. I look at maybe the celebrated latest, the aiming high reports. You know, there's one conclusion that I found. Sorry to say this. I think we are a stubborn nation, very stubborn. I concluded that we know almost everything that needs to be done. We have it line by line, nicely articulated, essays after essays, consultings after consultings, reports after reports, blueprint, you just call it. There are so many jargons that come out of this: labs, canvas, trajectory, wave, so many names. You know, consultants love to throw all these jargons for us. But honestly, everybody is saying the same thing. Nothing new. I seriously believe that, I seriously will say that if truly that we want to make a change, it is not about having another study, please. Anyone thinking of proposing another study, please forget about it. Because we all pretty much know what needs to be done for the country. Of course, the details are still needed to craft some of them. If I may throw to all of you, I mean, the aiming high reports, I believe many of you read it. I mean, the World Bank come in a very elegant studies coming up with the so-called the 6 items that need to be attended for Malaysia to go forward and to become a high-income nation. What are those 6? Let me say it to you. The first one, they were talking about Malaysia need to push up their growth. Anyone surprised by that? No. Number 2, Malaysia need to improve their competitiveness. Any surprise? No. We heard this so many times. We have various committees that are looking into this. We all familiar with all the IMD report, World Economic reports, and so on, doing business reports and so on. Number 3, the World Bank are saying that Malaysia need to create more high-skilled jobs. Come on, guys. Any surprise? No. No. And I go quickly. The other 3 is modernize your institution, improve the way government do things, and then inclusivity. You know, we need to close the gaps between the rich and the poor, and between the region, you know, gaps. And finally, about financing. They dare not to make it very clear that you need to collect more tax, actually. You know, I mean, they should say it right there and then. We need to, you know, to find ways to get more. So there's nothing new to me. Of course, I mean, we might have a new fact, new data, new way of presenting it, you know, new icons, new formatting and so on, but it's all saying the same thing. I tracked down, I mean, I think as early as RMK 6 or 7, way back in the 90s, the word competitiveness and everything get into our documents. But the challenge is that after 30 years, while the number seems not too bad, but structurally, what makes these numbers is actually what the issues are. I think that's what Prof. Wu are heading at, looking into the dimensions of productivity and so on. My take is that if any way we recover from this crisis without doing the reform at the same time, it is just a serious waste for the country. Of course, we are allowing people to go back and to back in the normal activities. But if truly that we don't address all those, I think the recovery probably to me is just a waste. You know, yes, we spend a lot of money, but are we going back to where we were before? Are we continuing the same education system that we have been doing for the last 60 years? Will we keep on saying that entrepreneurial nations means there are almost 1 million SMEs and 60% of the SMEs are very much micro enterprise? Can we make the country become a great nation by having all this? The way government do things, you know, anything that good, I mean, sorry to say this, anything that good out of this COVID crisis is that it reveals not the problems that we have been talking for long, and also it is pushing us. I mean, if Malaysia are not taking this as a lesson, I'm scared. You know, how far can we go? You know, we talk about digital, Prabhu, about talking about some young ladies have to climb up the tree and so on. You know, we are talking about firms are relying largely on the foreign workforce. If you look, I don't want to share the detailed number, but if you look in some measurement of complexity, I mean, to what extent that we adopt technologies and so on, we are very far behind. So now, I mean, to cut it short, at the end of it, to me, that one and most important thing that we tend to overlook is that while we are mitigating and the effect of COVID, you know, while we are helping, surely we need to help them. But please, we must make sure at the same time that end goal of transforming the nation need to be there. I know it's very difficult. Some say that why talk about so fast while the house is burning? But you need to think about it, because if you miss it, you are not going to want another COVID to come after this. So we need to make sure that you know, where possible, to tie up, you know, in terms of our you know, rescues and so on, so that it is in line with what we want to be. So just a final point, I look at there are 4 groups that need to be attended. We can discuss this a bit more detail later. One is about the people, the individual. Are we equipped with the right knowledge? Are we really ready to bring in all this technology? Do we have the skills? Do we have the capabilities? Can we be that entrepreneurial guys? Number 2, for the firms. You know, we cannot sustain with this. Malaysian firms are largely not doing the so-called 4th IR kind of things. Most of Malaysian firms are serving Malaysian markets. What do they want? They want it cheap and cheap and cheap. Best if you can give it free for them. Number 3 is about government. I'm not talking about the politics side. I'm talking about the way we do government. There are many aspects of the operation of the public services that need to be attended, including those you know, digitalizations, and probably also there's a lot of things that the government should not be doing, and let these so-called new societies, the NGOs and so on, the larger society, to come on board. And that's finally come to the point that I believe that at the end of it, you know, the society at large has to come forward, demand a change, be with the government, whatever government is there, need to really embrace this, and finally a committed decision is needed. No more studies. We have all the answers. If we don't have 100%, I'm sure we have 80% of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tan Sri Noor Azlan. And thank you for highlighting both Professor Wu and Professor Noor Azlan on the new economic model that we worked on in 2009, 2010, yeah? And those structural...
Pranoma, sorry, if I may want to say,
sure.
The documents that you produce, the 6 SRI, if you do another study, you will come to the same answer.
Exactly, that's what I wanted to say. You beat me to it. Because the following reports and studies from other institutions and agencies actually repeat or, you know, just confirming what we have, what we have mentioned in the report. So yeah, Prof. Tan Sri Nur Azlan said, was it degil? Stubborn, yeah, because someone mentioned in the chat box about being degil. I wonder who's the degil part, you know. But anyway, that was very interesting, and I think Tan Sri Nur Azlan being involved in some of these policies or some of the studies as well has highlighted that we have these really core issues that we have to work on. However, we have emerging issues now with the pandemic. Yeah, the emerging issues or new challenges are the rise in the part-time employment, the gig economy. How are we managing this? Do we have the infrastructure to manage this? The increase in temporary employment and the shadow, the informal economy. Now, however, we can discuss all this, and I'm sure Professor Ye Kim Ling would include some of these new challenges as well, as I mentioned. Yeah, over to you, Prof. Ye.
Pranama, before Prof. Ye take it up, allow me I just want to make sure that because so many people are listening to this, when I mention stubborn, the people, the government, the firms, and the society. All of them.
To all of us. Yeah, you're not sparing anyone. Okay, Prof. Ye.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Norma, and welcome participants. Let me share my screen. Okay. I would like to focus on three broad areas. One is pandemic impact and mitigation, given that the pandemic is still ongoing. And we had, in fact, that was a shock in terms of the rising infection rate that we have not managed to cap since a year. The second area is fiscal rebalancing and adjustment, given that we need to know how much government can still spend, and also importantly, what kind of adjustment later on it needs to do following the sharp spike in narrowing of the fiscal space. And then the third area is to look at some of the issues that have been discussed by Prof. Wu and Prof. Azlan to look into the priorities for the post-pandemic restructuring and priorities. Now, the first area that I'd like to touch upon is the COVID-19 impact, because it's still not done yet. So let me just take a step at what would be the growth trajectory and whether there's a need to actually increase relief spending. Now, if you compare the previous crisis, we had a very sharp decline in the second quarter, and in this crisis, we are already 4 quarters in a negative, or what you call a contraction. And we compare with the other Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis, you'll find that this time around, we have a fairly uneven recovery in the sense of both the pandemic shock as well as the impact of the pandemic on the different sectors of the economy. Now, the question now is, of course, what would be the second quarter, given that we have the economy has gradually improved to a negative 0.5 in the first quarter. What would it be like? Now, if you look at the what you call the downturn that we see in the second quarter, the base effect by itself would mean that Malaysia can actually emerge from its technical recession in this coming quarter. In this coming quarter, that's the second quarter, despite the fact that we have a lower, so-called a slight downturn in terms of output level, but that output level is still higher than the second quarter. So that base effect has distorted the growth rates. But nevertheless, what we would like to note here is that we have a base effect that actually distort the growth, year-on-year growth, and that is not does not give us the confidence that what would be the trajectory be like in the coming quarters and in the coming years. Now, importantly, the different growth rates that we see, we've seen that manufacturing has actually recovered. In fact, since June last year, it managed the whole reach first quarter 6.6% compared to services. Services which make up close to nearly 60% of the GDP, you find that it's still contracting, although it has recovered, but it's still in negative 2.3%, whereas the hardest hit sector has been the construction sector. It fell by 10.4%. But what's important to note here is that context sensitive services have actually plunged compared to these so-called non-context sensitive sectors like information and communications, finance, insurance. These are still showing positive growth when you compare year pre-pandemic and the year after. You find that these sectors continue to grow, show positive growth, whereas the other affected sectors like accommodation, there's a hotel and restaurants, food and beverage, and transport and storage. These are the sectors that are hardest hit because of their sensitivity to the SOPs and the movement control order and all this. So what we see here is that, of course, the differential impact has a bearing in terms of looking at whether further government relief and aid is needed or not, especially to ensure that there's no scarring effects, no permanent effects, especially on those sectors that are unable to survive in the current lockdown. Now, besides the short term, I think the longer term trajectory is of greater importance to us in a sense that the vaccination, with the availability of the vaccine, I think the prospects of containing the pandemic, I think has brightened considerably compared to last year when they're still researching on the vaccines. So this question of rolling out the vaccines as speedily as possible, and as we have seen in other countries, they have managed to open up the economy with a successful vaccinations. So the trajectory for Malaysia, the danger is that factors of other what they call declining into a low growth trajectory. See, that's of course the major concern, because the current baseline, where I think the growth can average about 4 to 5%. We note that the rebound in the global economy, together with the turnaround, especially if the consumers and investors' confidence recover, you'll find that I think for Malaysia to achieve average of 5% or even 4.5 to 5 is not an issue over the medium term. See? But a bigger concern is what are the constraints and what are the factors, the impediments that may perhaps derail the growth trajectory to a low growth scenario, whereby we can only achieve maybe 3 to 4%, and that will actually delay Malaysia's ability to achieve the high income goal. Given that you need a per capita income growth at least 3.5% per annum in order to reach your high income trajectory. But more importantly, of course, in the immediate term, let's look at fiscal adjustment and rebalancing, because this remains one of the key Achilles heel of Malaysia's macroeconomic what they call balancing in terms of what is the scope and what's the risk and what are trade-offs and complementarities. If you look at the fiscal packages that have been dished out over the last year and compared to other countries, Malaysia's spending is not overly small or overly large compared to more than 10% and above for advanced economies, given their capacity to spend more. So Malaysia is about the middle, situated in the middle, similar to other middle income countries. So in terms of size, we are about average across the countries in terms of fiscal spending. But importantly, what is our capacity? After each financial crisis, or for example, the global financial crisis, our debt level actually jumped up in a 10 percentage point, and then COVID-19 another 10 percentage point to around 60 to close to 70% right now. See, and of course, if you add in the contingent liabilities, or that it could go up to maybe 80%. Now, of course, the high government debt, as shown in many studies, they may not necessarily impede growth, but it will be a burden to growth, you see, and that's a concern, especially if we include all the contingent liabilities. So we are almost at the upper end, upper limit, you see. But nevertheless, as long as we can commit to a sustainable fiscal path, I think the trajectory will very much depend on to what extent we can increase our government spending efficiency, improving tax collection efficiency, and including tax buoyancy and all that, and importantly, whether we can sustain the growth. Now, in terms of the short-term fiscal space that is available, especially if we look at now, where there have been many calls for further relief and support because of the extension of MCO, the full MCO, you find that this is the baseline trajectory. We could hit a deficit of close to 6% by this year if we maintain the current budget and current trajectory and current spending. But what is note here is that in this analysis we show that perhaps we can still spend an additional 20 billion, or about 1.4% of GDP, to actually to ensure that the vulnerable groups are taken care of, and then importantly to avoid any scarring effects, especially if those are the longer term economic capital being destroyed because of the continuing downturn and faced by some of the key sectors. Of course, these are so-called possible fiscal adjustment and trade-offs, but in terms of the post-pandemic structural reforms that are important in order to achieve the high growth trajectory. Now, if you look at some of the key nexus that I put here, they are fairly similar. I think Tan Sri Azlan has mentioned about our ability to craft out some of the nice blueprints. But importantly, let me just, from my perspective, I think my topmost priority is actually in terms of political governance, and governance reforms, because I think currently what's inhibiting confidence level is also the elevated political uncertainty and risk. So I think what is noted here is that if we want to be a developed and advanced nation, there are complementarities in terms of building very strong institutions, because these strong institutions are not just key enablers, but also they could be catalysts in terms of new initiatives and moving into, like what Prof. Wu mentioned about embracing SDG and taking forward the new agenda. So that's very important for me in terms of key nexus, number one. Number two is that we note that monetary, financial, and fiscal rebalancing for Malaysia. I think both fiscal and monetary are almost at the limits, near the limits. We cannot lower further interest rates, given that we are near the lower bound. And of course, the growth burden has shifted to the fiscal policy. And then importantly, we also know that fiscal policies, we have diminished buffers, but nevertheless, we can still spend a little bit more to alleviate some of the hardships that are faced by the vulnerable firms and households. Of course, the burden, the shift between short and long-term pain, and that I think will fall largely, fiscal adjustments will largely fall on the fiscal policy in terms of a further adjustment down the road, whereby spending will be constrained. But importantly, if we have a coordinated monetary as well as fiscal policy coordination, then of course you will deliver a larger outcome in terms of effectiveness. So that's very important. And then of course, in the future, we have no choice but to embark on the necessary fiscal reforms in order to strengthen our tax ratio. Currently, it's among the lowest of the middle-income countries, 17% of GDP. We have to raise it above 20%, you see, so that's very critical. Now, in terms of the third area is industrial investment and trade competitiveness. One structural feature we note here is that our manufacturing. We need to continue to emphasize manufacturing, largely because of its strong linkages as well as competitiveness in terms of sustaining our external sectors. There's of course the trade-offs between low-cost, labor-intensive towards moving towards a costlier, capital and knowledge-intensive industry. I think that shift will have to be that has to be assessed by the private sector in terms of embracing some of the structural upgrading. But importantly, one point to note here is the FDI. There are some quarters have been fearing the FDI could be crowding out domestic investment, but that's not the case, because our FDI inflow used to be about 5 to 6% of GDP in the heydays in the 70s and 80s. Now on average, we are only receiving 2 to 3% of GDP in terms of FDI inflow, compared to our private investment to GDP ratio is around 16 to 17% currently, maybe slightly lower now. Now, that's still an underinvestment in the case of Malaysia. We need to raise it up to at least 20 to 25% of GDP, and that's very critical in order to shift towards high value activities. Importantly, that also will help. The complementary spin-off will be actually a reduced reliance on the low skilled labor. And the other issues I won't touch upon, I think they are well covered by our two earlier panelists: income growth and distribution. There's no doubt, because of the accentuated income inequality, because of the asymmetric impact, we need now, the government will have to reallocate its resources to spend more on social expenditure, social development, as well as social operating expenses. So that shift, we will have to accommodate that, and that means the government will need to see a shift from what they call public sector led to a more private sector led growth. So that would be the key direction. Of course, we have been talking about private sector led growth, all these plans that we have had, and then importantly, our long-standing and binding constraint, education and skills. So that some readjustment, especially focusing on STEM subjects, STEM education, English proficiency. I think that's important because there are complementary effects in terms of upgrading our indigenous technological and innovation capabilities. Because without that foundation, you cannot build that. Now, importantly, there are some bright spots in the sense that we see some of these so-called advanced technologies, advanced industries, E&E, are fairly large in terms of their size. They also have a very high impact multiplier, as well as strong backward linkages. So I won't go into detail, but just to highlight that these are the sectors that provide some so-called our external engine can still remain a main power for Malaysia, to power Malaysia's transformation, as well as structural upgrading. And then, of course, the pandemic has affected a large part of our wholesale and retail, and that will be our concern given its large size in economies. So in conclusion, let me say that the extended MCO has actually lowered our growth trajectory. I think from the initial 6 to 7.5 to perhaps right now will be about 5 to 6%, because this current lockdown, especially over a month, each day it costs about 300 to 400 million. You actually shave off about 3 to 4% percentage points of GDP growth. But I think importantly, complementary reforms are needed to raise our economic resilience, sustainability, and of course standard of living. And as mentioned by Prof. Wu, the global recovery and the post-pandemic reforms, if we can get our handle on it, I think the opportunity to raise Malaysia's medium-term trajectory to this 5 to 6% is actually within reach. But I think the main concern right now that is actually the political and policy uncertainty will be the key impediment and the primary risk factor that may actually actualize the low growth trajectory of 3 to 4% post-pandemic. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ye. You have again highlighted the structural problems or structural issues, but giving the trade-offs and complementarities between these policies, yeah, especially improving our productivity and all that. And you've also shared where are our sweet spots, and we are clever enough to manage efficiently the different policies. They should support each other, and the economy will have a sustainable type of growth. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, I think you are waiting for answers to your questions that you have posed earlier. I have some of them here. Maybe I should just read it out, and then I'll read 2 or 3, and I leave it to the panelists on who wants to go first to respond to which question. Yeah, can we do that? All right. So the first question came from Mr. Herbert. It's very short question. That modernized, well, that's the way it is. Modernized tax system to improve buoyancy? Question mark. And the second question is from Mr. Ng Boon Chan. Yeah. Growing regionalization, RCEP, AFTA, NAFTA, and the new bloc following recent G7 meeting, how will this affect globalization? And the third question is a bit longer. What are your thoughts on how do we break away from this stubbornness at the individual and community level? And I guess that will be to Tan Sri Nur Azlan. And it is disheartening to note that Malaysia is good at trailblazing many initiatives, but at the end of the day, we always lose out our strategic position. For example, the Islamic Financial Global Leadership. Yeah, so I'll stop there and allow you, who wants to go first? Do we go in the order that you spoke? Yeah, so it looks like Professor Wu.
I think everyone wants to hear about the stubbornness. How can we address the stubbornness problem?
Yes.
Well, maybe I can I put it very strong there because it is a sense of frustrations in seeing that documents after document. That's why I come to the point that we need a change, a committed decisions that we want to change, and we make ourselves obliged to it, set our goal, monitor that, and talk about it. We don't set a vision for 30 years and we only start talking about achievement at the last 5 years. We need to talk about it earlier. So, well, again, I mean, I believe that part of it is of the, a legacy of things. We are, I will say, as I put up the numbers earlier, if you look at the numbers, we are not bad. It has improved quite a lot from $2,000 to 11,000 plus. But the behaviors are not changing. The way that we the try for success and so on is not there. I believe that it is we are governed by certain behaviors, and the surrounding around us is influencing that. I give you one example. If we ask every single person whether do you like to see the presence of a lot of foreign workforce, everyone will definitely say, I don't like it. But when we know that having less foreign workforce will make life a bit more, cost will go a bit higher, then people say that, no, hold on. I still want my roti canai, I still want my teh tarik. We want to be a developed nation, we want to be an advanced nation, but we are not ready to live like one. I think many of us had that experience of living abroad. How do you treat your waste? How do you treat, let's say, for example, going to a restaurant, a dine-in restaurant is is an expensive thing. There is no jual tepi jalan, things like that. So I think if we want to, we need somewhere to start. I still believe that the role of government is there, the role of the public is there, the role of single individual is there. And we need to kind of, there should be like a path. The journey will not be an easy journey. We cannot entice people to say that, oh, we're going to have a high income and life will be a lot easier. No, in high income countries, if you don't work hard, if you don't catch up, then you will be left behind. So there's something like the incentive of doing it right, get rewarded, or not doing it right, you will be penalized, need to be put in place in some ways, So therefore, you can help the poor, you can help the handicaps, but you don't want to go to the point that you are helping everybody without caring what will happen to them. For example, like in the recent crisis, we are pouring millions to the SMEs. Are we seeing SMEs change the way they do things? The way they operate, the way they produce their products and services. So we hope that all this can come together. I would like to put a little bit more conditionality to all the support.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Prof. Wu, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think the stubbornness is related to the following two phenomena that we observe in Malaysia. Malaysia has a very high amount of capital outflow. If you look at what a group of ex-IMF staffers have calculated every year for unregistered capital outflow, the three highest countries are China, Mexico, and Malaysia in absolute amount. On a per capita basis, it works out for around $400 per person in China, 650 in Mexico, and 2,785 for Malaysia. Malaysia being richer, so maybe you can afford more, but the truth is the capital flight is unusually high and sustained for Malaysia. The second phenomenon of outflow that I want to talk about is that the World Bank around 10 years ago did a study in which it says 20% of university graduates would no longer be working in Malaysia within 5 years of graduation. That means we have got a huge outflow of funds and a huge outflow of educated manpower, while we see this huge inflow of low-skilled manpower. This is why FDI became so important for us, because FDI brought in capital, replacing part of what fled out, and it brought in technology, the foreign engineer, to replace the local talents that have left. So if you were to look at the catch-up process in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they did not have FDI play any role. They would just license the foreign technology and do it themselves. But we can't, because we don't have the critical mass. All of this is tied to this stubbornness you're talking about, Tan Siri. Because it comes from a lack of trust that is surprising to me. And this lack of trust is why the tax collection rate is so low. The only countries with high tax rates are those that achieve the highest level of political support for the spending in their countries. And Malaysia has been able to avoid high taxes because we have got a lot of oil that came our way. And so in the white elephant projects that had wasted the money was really not a pain on the public, because it was not resources that we tax on the public to pay for the white elephants or the losses. Just think of all the losses that Bank Bhumiputra Finance did in Hong Kong. All of that was covered up by the oil money that we got. So there was no pain when we had to do wasteful things. But things have changed now. The revenue flows from Petronas has declined, and the opening of China and the rest of the world to investment have reduced our proportion of foreign direct investment. Our share of total foreign direct investment has gone down, which is why Kim Ling said we have, instead of 5 to 6% of investment from FDI, we now have 2 to 3. And this is linked to the same kind of low domestic investment. Our level of domestic investment is lower than before 1997. And I think that this has to do with that we need to abandon the old instruments that have been in use to promote the goals of the NEP. We have to promote the NEP with new instruments that do not cause so much capital flight and that do not cause so much brain drain. In fact, the frightening to me is that the capital flight and brain drain is becoming multiracial in nature. The brain drain being multiracial in nature is very unfortunate. This is not just stubbornness. This is a loss of confidence. And I think this is where political leadership in terms of national unity is exceedingly important. Somehow we got to get away from divisive politics and to more when it is the politicians who are weakening up the stubbornness, creating the stubbornness in us, because we come not to trust that the government would do the right thing for us. Like Tan Sri makes it very clear. The playbook is well known. He in fact, but then how come we are unable to implement the playbook? And I think it is because we think that the government may not be able to do a good job, or we make the mistake of mistaking the policy instruments of NEP with the goals of NEP itself. I think the NEP instruments have reached their warranty and are no longer effective in generating the kind of growth. It's just like our public education system has the quantity now. What we need is quality. And this is where I think a process of public education by the political leadership is exceedingly important. Now stop there.
Thank you, Prof. Wu. Yeah, okay, Prof. Ye, your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps I can offer economic theory of stubbornness. Basically, I think it stems from the fundamental theory of so-called rent-seeking and perverse or misaligned economic incentives that actually sustain the interest groups in not pursuing the right reforms. So we do have many sectors that are afflicted by what they call so-called lack of structural reforms, is because those structural reforms will go against their economic interests and they do not have the economic incentives to actually reform. You see. So I think that's on one hand, the economic incentive. Of course, the other equally important part is the political incentives. You want to preserve your support base, your voter base, and all that. That also would be another political economy explanation for why it's so difficult to transform or so difficult to restructure the economy. Thank you.
Prof. Ye, yeah, if I can elaborate on the structural problems that we have, which is about low value add, low wage. Hence, that's also part of the reason why I think we're losing, to add on to the vested interest, not wanting to change, to upgrade the technology, and all that, because you're still profiting from it. So there are several explanations to our condition as well, aside from what Prof. Wu and also Prof. Tan Sri Azlan has mentioned earlier. Okay, let's move on to the next 3 questions, although some of the questions I think were not responded to earlier.
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Raymond Navratnam here.
Yes, Tan Sri, hi. Please.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank
Good.
you. Please go ahead.
I must say very quickly, I've enjoyed your chairmanship and the panelists. I wish I was there. But the point is, this stubbornness that Professor No talked about is real. But I would say it is the political stubbornness. People want to maintain their vested interests, either in government or in the civil service or wherever. They want to perpetuate ketuanan. They want to perpetuate a new economic policy, not in its original form as I recall, but the abuse and distortion of the policy. And underlying all this is racism, and I'm afraid that is the poison in our whole system, which prevents us from moving forward, because for everything we think of the racial implication, the political implication. You can't run a government or an economy that way, and I think you will agree. But if you disagree, tell me. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. Yes. We'll take the next 2, 3 questions. Yeah. The first one is for Professor Wu from Gao Min. Yeah. I still remember you said that Malaysia's capability in the economy maybe can afford one or two, or at most two MCOs. If the third MCO comes, it may have to open the economy like India. And now MCO 3 already, 3.0 is already, and the situation is even worse. And MCO is endless as well. Do you think the country is or will be in serious economic contraction and downturn? Yeah, that's the question from Gao Min. And then also from Gao Min, but for Tan Sri Nur Azlan, Tun Dr. Mahathir recently said that the COVID-19 are taking away the middle class in Malaysia. What do you think of what he said, and what are your ideas? Yeah, and to everyone, what do you think of Dr. Mahathir's idea of Mageran? Will it make the country faster in coming out of COVID-19 and the economic recovery? And I take the last one from Jacob. What's the cost of a quick lockdown and impact on the GDP? 6 weeks, is it? 6 weeks lockdown. Yeah, 6-week lockdown and impact on the GDP. Yeah. So yes, who wants to go first this time? Prof. Ye, you want to go first?
Okay, the last question is the easiest to answer since I already presented the figure. Now, if you look at 2020, the second quarter, the GDP actually contracted, lost almost 60 billion. That works out to about 700 million. So if you take for this MCO, let's say it's less restrictive, and you assume, let's say, for 40% or 50%, so we'll be losing close to 20 billion a day. So in total, it adds up to about around 4% of GDP, estimated GDP for this full 1 month MCO. And of course, the impact will be much bigger if it was to be extended further. And it depends on the extent to which the economic activities are allowed to resume, and then importantly for consumption activities to gradually normalize. So a lot of moving parts to the equation as to where our trajectory, but very important, we will be likely out of the technical recession because of the low base effect. Thank you.
Yeah. Who wants to go next? Okay, Prof. Wu.
I think it is the third MCO is no doubt will cause a significant contraction of the economy, but then we are only at the halfway point of the year, and if the economies in Western Europe and North America were to recover, they would be pulling in goods from Malaysia. So even though we may not control the disease, we will not be able to prolong a complete lockdown, largely because we will not be able to supply the orders for the goods that are coming in. So right now is no doubt a knockdown on the economy. Then I think what is important is that you really need to get a sense of the government fiscal spending right now is less a stimulus than disaster relief. Stimulus means that there was a collapse in aggregate demand that caused the unemployment to be created. In this case, it's a shutdown of production that caused the unemployment to appear. I think that the handling of the disease in the future will determine a great deal of how we are going to be able to to be able to adopt a high growth policy package. Because in order to overcome the stubbornness that Tan Sri talks about, you must not be in the middle of a crisis like a pandemic. I think many times during a national emergency, you can summon the political will to make big changes. But I think that a pandemic may not be the kind of national emergency that would permit bold political actions. I hope I'm wrong, but I'd like to hear what Tan Sri has to say, whether he thinks that this is the kind of existential threat that allows a government to take bold, decisive actions.
Okay, Tan Sri?
I'm scared that what we get out from this webinar is stubborn. Now, I like to make reference to someone asking about Tun M's statement about the middle class. Actually, I've seen some numbers. You know, we are so used to the idea of B40, M40, and T20, though I have some reservations about using that as a policy, you know, kind of classification. But broadly, we are seeing kind of across the board of a reduction like that, kind of whether you are M40, B40, and so on. I mean, there's a reduction to that. And if any number that I can quote about, I mean, the numbers that I've seen about 600,000 household, isi rumah, 600,000 household of M40, which means that before this they earn 4,850 and above, and because of the crisis, the household income has dropped below 4,850. So I'm just using the line as a way of saying how will that affecting across all sectors. So there are various degrees depending on which sector you are in, what kind of jobs you are in, and so on. If you are, let's say, M40, who are selling souvenirs for the tourists, probably you will be wiped out by now, you know. So there are various degrees. And yes, I agree. The fact that there will be a lot of reduction, I mean, wiping out of the middle class. So that itself will be a major challenge for Malaysia. Well, in terms of Mageran or not, I mean, I stay away from politics, but I want to say this throughout my stay here. I mean, I'm seconded to the Economic Action Council. I want to make sure that everybody listen to this. I mean, because I was here for the last 1 year, almost every week we are sitting. The Prime Minister is chairing the Economic Action Council, and we are looking into the economic situation and trying to find a way of how to mitigate the impact and getting out of it. I must say that, you know, many of us are economists. There is no textbooks in anywhere in the world that can teach us how to ask everybody to stay at home and still get the economy moving. It is very difficult. It's almost impossible. So we have to find a way of how to meet. The strategy now is about to mitigate the impact, but my concern earlier is, while we are attending the pain now, do we carry that longer term objective in us? That's why we were looking into the trade-off between what we are doing now. Are we compromising something in the future? You know, with respect to, I want to also respond to Tan Sri Navaratnam's point of view. I know Tan Sri is, I mean, you are very focused on some of the issues. I will say like this. I mean, to me, there are roles that the government can play. There are roles that the public can play, and every one of us. If you look at it truthfully, I mean, you know, I was surprised to know that, for example, that the larger portion of our industries, be it, I mean, regardless of any ethnic groups, are not employing technologies. You know, I mean, we are being kind of being pampered by saying that you will always be able to get the so-called cheap talents coming from abroad. I think that is a very serious thing, and that push down the wages across all, more so at the lower end. And at the end of it, we will be in fear of making changes. Look at how we try to bring in GST. You know, for more than 30 years, we are trying to bring this in. and we kill it off just overnight. Much more because of probably the readiness of the nation. I mean, in Malaysia, any crime from the bottom, will make a call. Will make a call. If, for example, you want to instill that discipline of working hard, not working hard, you'll be penalized. I mean, a lot of people will be very upset. I mean, if you say that, okay, I can remove the foreign workforce, but roti canai now will be at around 2 ringgit, and people say that this is ridiculous. I would prefer to have that foreign workforce to do my roti canai and compromising. That's why I said living in an advanced, a high income nation, cleanliness and everything will come. So we need to address that level of income. And I say stubbornness because I think I take the view that you cannot just, sorry to say, you just cannot blame the government. At the end of it, someone will ask you who choose all this and so on. I mean, it's a circle. Everything is interrelated. You know, I think I like to be positive on this. I believe that Malaysia has a good track record. We do have problems, and this COVID is quite a determining factor for us. Because to me, yes, the COVID is pain, but COVID actually opening up an opportunity for us to really wake up and make the change. I really hope that will be in place of how we are moving forward, getting out of the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. It looks like we are not able to take more questions unless Tan Sri Raymond Navaratnam has other comments. Tan Sri, we fully agree with you. Yeah, but if you have other comments, this is an old friend, so I should give him some airtime. All right, okay. Some very good questions. Tan Sri, would you have other questions?
Yeah, comments? Can I mention this?
Oh, sure.
This is deja vu. I've been involved in economic planning from the long time ago. I think Prof. Noma and all the others are aware. But you're right. All of you are entirely right. We are playing the same record. It's now broken, but we're still playing it. And that's because we are not able to do what is good for the long term of the nation. We are not. We lost our trust in government. We have lost the capacity to be able to do better because we are protecting our Western interests. And so the people must rise and say, look, what's in it for me? You are up there. You are wealthy, but the income gaps are widening. What do I do? And we must educate the people to realize that they are losing and that they should be very careful who they vote for. You vote for the wrong people, then we have ourselves to blame. I think we are to blame now. So come the next round, we got to make sure we move to a better direction, a better to restructure, because nobody has been talking about restructuring. We are dealing with the budget, with the pandemic, and as of now, what happens after that? Where are the structural changes, the reforms, especially in education? We are producing unemployed graduates. Is that fair to our young people? So we must ask ourselves why the academic leadership, why the professional leadership is not acting bolder, speaking up, speaking out. It took a long time for even this very good webinar to come to some basic issue like the NEP, like the white elephant, the elephant in the room. Why? Something's wrong with our psychology. I think we've got sick, and maybe tired, and maybe disgusted with with the way things are going. We can only hope and pray that the younger people will rise and say, look, we have let them down. The politicians especially have let us all down. I better not say more before I get into more trouble.
Thank you, Tan Sri.
But as you know, Professor, we all work and speak up in the national interest as patriots.
Yes.
As patriots. and God bless us all.
Thank you, Tan Sri.
Masih.
Thank you. So yeah, I think as reminded by everyone that we should not let this crisis go to waste. Yeah, there's a saying that don't let a good crisis go to waste. So this is a good opportunity for us to look at to reform some of the structural or our structural problems that have been with us for a while now. So in closing, since I won't be able to take more questions, the questions will be, I think the panelists are also, they're able to see the questions, and later if they want, some of them perhaps, yeah. And but in closing, before I pass on to Karen, I just want to say that I think we have concluded here that the right mix of monetary, financial, and fiscal policies is needed to ensure that overall effectiveness in securing a sustainable economic recovery. But also, although Prof. Ye mentioned, but I would like to highlight here, and this has been highlighted by many other studies as well, that especially now when we are exposed to the gaps that we have with regards to protecting our people. So having a stronger social protection is the way, is one of the reforms, aside from the ESG, Prabhu, is also the social protection, which is the social, which is the S of the ESG, should be strong as well in our public policy. Because when the structure of the economy where more technology will be taking over some of our jobs, yeah, we want to further accelerate digitalization in order to enhance productivity, and all that, more people will not necessarily benefit, or you will have losers from whatever reforms that that we are doing. And also, not just losers, there are so many of us within the system that is vulnerable. So ladies and gentlemen, I think you agree with me that we've had a very good session. The rich experiences of the panelists, including the participants, yeah, in the name of Tan Sri Raymond Nabaratnam, have contributed to this deep and insightful analysis. And please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in thanking our panelists, our distinguished panelists, by giving them a round of applause. And after that, over to you, Karen. Can we clap? Do you want to take a photo, Karen? Or
yes, I will do that. I will do that now. I'd like to ask Prof. Norma and all of our panelists to just smile for the camera for a minute.
Let me clap on behalf of everybody to the panel and the chairperson. Wonderful.
Thank you. Just one more minute. Okay, thank you very much. Please join me also in thanking our wonderful moderator, Professor Norma, for conducting that session exceptionally well. And on behalf of JCI and MEA, I also thank all our panelists and all our audience for joining us today. We did exceed the time a little bit. Thank you for your patience. And we will hold another event on Thursday, the 17th of June. This will be jointly organized by the Jeffrey Sachs Center at Sunway University with EPU, the Economic Planning Unit, and it will address the Sustainable Development Goal #1, which is ending poverty, especially the COVID-19 induced poverty. So I've put the details of that event in our chat. Do register and see you at our next event. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you, Karen.
thank you. Have a great.
Thank you, Dr. Norma.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Ye, and everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.